Great to have you all with us on this week's episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. I don't think it is an overstatement to say that today's guest is an absolute legend in career and technical education. As the co-founder, as the president of the Manufacturing Skills Standards Council, today's guest has probably done as much, if not more than anybody in the United States and around the globe to prepare the next generation of frontline workers in advanced manufacturing. I have tremendous respect for his work in career and technical education. What many of us maybe didn't realize is that Leo Reddy had an incredible career in the career foreign service prior to his time in the area of workforce development. And as I've learned about that career, as I have read about that career, I will tell you that Leo is not just a legend in career and technical education. He is a legend in the field of diplomacy. He is a legend with the State Department, and he has done some incredible work that I think it's safe to say, and again, not an overstatement to say, has had a tremendous impact on the world that we live in today, especially from a geopolitical standpoint. So it is my great honor to introduce someone who is a great friend, someone for whom I have tremendous admiration. Leo Reddy, thank you so much for joining us on the Tech Ed Podcast.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Matt. And the admiration is mutual, believe me. I have to interview you next time, so we get you.
You let me know when, and I'll be there. And anytime Leo calls, I answer, and you know that. And we've had a great relationship, and I really enjoy working with you. And I've really enjoyed learning about your history and about your career. And I know our audience is going to enjoy learning that as well. Let's talk about this. I mean, you've had an incredibly successful career. It's not, I think it's fair to say it's been a long career and a really, really admirable one. But there's one consistent theme, Leo, throughout this whole career, and that is this incredible commitment that you have to public service, both in the federal government, the nonprofit sector running 501c3s, and also in the private sector. So what are the origins of this commitment? Where does this commitment come from, Leo?
Well, it's pretty clear to me. I had 10 relatives in World War II.
Wow.
They were my heroes. I mean, truly. They were my inspiration for my entire life. Fortunately, they all came back alive, a couple of them wounded, but they all came back. But I've really always worshipped those people. And my mother also encouraged thinking about public service. She even wanted me to be a priest at one point. I couldn't handle that one, particularly that vow of chastity. That was too much to deal with. But still, I mean, public service has been kind of in my blood. I was very inspired by Jack Kennedy, who remember made this famous statement about, don't ask what your country can do for you, we can do for your country. So I was a young idealist, I guess, tried to be pragmatic, but I was an idealist at the same time. But a very specific thing that happened in my earlier life that I thought I should mention to probably explain why I became so committed to the Cold War. Had so much deep involvement in that particular topic. What happened is I had a junior year abroad program. I was at Georgetown University. I had a junior year abroad program in Vienna, Austria. And that was in 1954-55. That was an incredibly dramatic point in the Cold War. The tensions in the Cold War, as a guy from Boston, I never realized there could be that much propaganda, that much intensity, ideological warfare, people running parades all over the city all the time, flying flags everywhere, all kinds of rallies. I mean, the whole atmosphere was very tense and very exciting. I also got to know people I was in a group of students, people from the embassy came by to help us, to keep us out of trouble, right? Not go to the wrong place in Vienna.
Sure.
I was very impressed with the embassy people. So the idea of working in diplomacy in the Cold War really caught on. So that was really kind of the origins of my orientation to public policy, which continued throughout my career, but that was the way it began.
Well, and I have a fascination, and we'll get into this with the Cold War era. I came of age in the 80s and early 90s, and so many transformative things happening at that time. Transformative things, by the way, as our audience is about to learn, that you had a tremendous influence on. I'll also just reference Jack Kennedy, in as much as he was an influence in your career. I would say that if I've got two favorite speeches that I've ever heard, the first one. Actually, the second one in order would be Jack Kennedy's speech at Rice University when he called on our nation to go to the moon, and not because it was easy, but because it was hard. And so many of the decisions that I've made over the course of my life have been inspired by those words by Jack Kennedy. I was actually absolutely transfixed by the whole idea of Camelot when I was a young man, and so very, very interested in that side of things. The best speech that I ever heard, by the way, and tying it back to our conversation today, it was the one that Ronald Reagan delivered at Pointe du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, and that was just such a moving speech. And like you, I had relatives that fought in World War II. In my case, they were uncles, so my father's brothers, and I still listening to his stories about his brothers coming back from the war when he was still a young boy are just incredibly influential. And so many of these things, I think, influence the way that I look at the world, and certainly the way that I endured the back end of the Cold War and the way that I look back on it. When you were growing up and when you were coming of age, you served as an anti-submarine warfare and a gunnery officer on destroyers in the 6th and 7th Fleets. So first of all, thank you for that service, and thank you for the freedom that we enjoy because of people like you who gave it to us. What years were you doing that, Leo? And tell us a little bit about that experience.
It was 1956, 59. When I was graduating from college, we had the Korean War draft was on. We all had to serve somehow. So I decided, since I had naval officers in my family, I decided to go to OCS in Newport and get a reserve officer's commission in Newport. So the very moment I finished in Newport, they put me on a destroyer to accompany the Forrestal across the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean. And that was an amazing experience. But when we got to the Med, I spent 1 year there, but it really was an exciting year. It was a time when we had the Soviet military, the Soviet Navy began to appear. We were well ahead of them, but they started building their own Navy, and we were seeing Soviet ships around. We're collecting intelligence on Soviet ships. We're running all kinds of night operations, land operations. We did some operations on the beach at Lebanon where I was the young officer on a boat with my guns and so with my crew to help American citizens who were trying to evacuate. All that kind of stuff was pretty exciting. But then I was transferred to Pearl Harbor. Now, this sounds like cushy duty, and it wasn't bad serving in the Med and Pearl Harbor, but still, there was a lot going on in Pearl Harbor also. And in my private life, where I met my wife there, I started a family there. But the experience of being a gunnery officer on a full-size destroyer is an amazing experience for somebody who's 23, 24 years old. I mean, really, life at sea is really it's a young people's game. I don't think any of my captains are more than 33 years old or something. Wow. It's for young, and you can understand why.
Sure.
A lot of tough weather and a lot of exercises, a lot of work. But it was just an amazing experience in terms of management and so forth. So I really thought that was great.
An amazing experience indeed, and to kind of put that into perspective from a historical standpoint, I mean, if you're in Pearl Harbor in the late 1950s, you're really less than 20 years following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, if I'm correct, on December 7th of 1941. So in many ways, a lot of that history is still really, really fresh. So these perspectives that we're getting from that, that tail end of the period of time following the end of the war, really, really fascinating. And I know to our young students that listen, and we have a number of them, make sure you're paying attention and listening to this incredible story of this gentleman who served during the Cold War, who served in so many aspects of historical situations and in so many of the arenas, if you will, that really created the world that we live in today. Part of that service was, get this, at the CIA. So you went on to work at the CIA. So just curious about that experience. First of all, what year were you with, or did you begin your work with the CIA, Leo?
It was 1961 to 62.
Got it. So the early 60s.
So I left the Navy. I was never intended to be a career naval officer, but I did my duty, and after my 3.5 years, I left in 1959, and I came back to the States. But I always retained my strong interest in being in the Foreign Service and engaging in diplomacy. So I came back to Georgetown to get a graduate degree in international relations, and I had wonderful, wonderful professors there. And one of them I got to know personally very well, and he got to know me, and he realized that I was running out of money. I did my MA, and I was about to start a PhD. And he said, "Well, you've got to earn, you've got to earn some money. So I'll tell you what, I'll help you get a job with the CIA.
Unbelievable.
And so you can pay the rent, and your wife is about to deliver, so you can get medical care." And I said, "Gee, I want to go in the Foreign Service." He said, but try this stint. You're not in the Foreign Service yet. You got to pass this exam, and it may be a year before you ever even get a chance to get in. So go to work, try out the CIA. So, so I could not have come to the CIA at a more fascinating time. I was really lucked out because the CIA, during World War II, when Wild Bill Donovan ran the place, you didn't know where it was, right?
Huh.
There was a little town, it was in Quonset huts, it was in apartment buildings, it was spread out in all these little locations all over Washington, D.C. And that's when I joined. So I actually was right down the hall from Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA in that period of time, right across the street from the State Department, actually. Those were old buildings, and those old buildings, every single analyst there had a personality, right? Every office had mementos and memoirs and interesting people in the office. Mostly people had been in the CIA during World War II with Wild Bill Donovan. These are really interesting people. I had so much fun going around to the offices and talking to them and making friends with them. I was in Soviet biographics. I was an analyst. I never went abroad to do clandestine work. I was just an headquarters analyst. What those analysts do is they take information from all sources and they write up reports for people like the president,
Wow,
and the Secretary of State. So I specialized in Soviet biographics, which meant that I was preparing biographic information on important people in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. It was really kind of a fun thing. And we felt we were helping our leaders be well prepared. They know the personalities. When we wrote a CIA bio on somebody, some prominent communist official somewhere, we told the full story. And we knew a lot about these people. I was amazed at how much information we had on them,
right?
Including their affairs and how they were, the number of people they killed and so forth, and how they were treating their wives. And we knew a lot about each one of these people. So
that's amazing.
Our reports are actually pretty interesting.
I would imagine. Well, and when people say that Leo Reddy does his homework, now we know where that comes from, right? Is that you spent all this time doing homework on individuals in the Soviet Union in the early days of the Cold War. And by the way, Allen Dulles, is that the same individual whose name shows up on the airport in Washington, D.C.? Is that the same individual? Or is
no, that's John Foster Dulles, actually.
I see.
His brother. His brother was the Secretary of State at that time, but he was right across the street.
Huh,
well, the other point I make CIA is, the other thing that made it interesting is while I was there, we moved.
Okay.
We closed down all these little dicky offices and all these secret places all around Washington, and we moved to the new building.
Yeah.
You've all seen the picture of this giant CIA building in Langley, Virginia, right? Mm-hmm. big bureaucratic thing with like 5 branches now. And I moved out there. And when I went there, the whole place lost its allure for the simple reason that all the Soviet people, like myself, the Soviet specialists, biographics and everything, were all put in one room. And we realized when we were all together in one room that there were about 100 of us. We didn't know how many there were of us. But we're all in one room. Huh. And every person was in a little cubicle in that room. So you'd come into the room and you'd see this sea of little cubicles. In other words, all the people lost their personality, right? They all looked the same. They all looked anonymous. No pictures in their rooms, in their offices. They didn't have offices. They had these little tiny cubicles. It was since I don't really want to spend my whole life, the rest of my life on this. So it was about that time, after a few months there, that I did pass the Foreign Service exam, and I came into the State Department as a career Foreign Service officer, FSO as we're called in the trade.
Are we now like 63, 64, or what year are we in when you made that move?
I was 62 now, so I was in CIA like 61, 62. I passed the Foreign Service exam in 62, and that's when I began my diplomatic career. But because I had I was a little bit lucky because I had a background in military affairs, intelligence affairs, and so forth. I spent almost my entire career in working in European security, in the Cold War stuff, European security, NATO, of course, arms control negotiations. That really became really a specialist in that area.
And that service included this incredible work on the Helsinki Accords, and we're going to get into that now. And if our audience isn't familiar with what the Helsinki Accords and the Helsinki process is and was, you're about to learn, and it's a fascinating story. Let's start with that. What were the Helsinki Accords, Leo, and then talk a little bit about your really prolific role in architecting them.
I had a ringside seat and actually a strong leadership role in that particular historic development. And let me just give people a tiny background as fast as I can. But when President Nixon was inaugurated as president, remember Nixon was a very, very strong anti-communist. When he debated with Kennedy in that debate, the guys were competing with each other to see who would be most anti-communist, right? A very far right Republican, if you want to put it in those terms.
Sure.
And anyway, it was a total amazement when he was president. When he became president, I'm now announcing a new era of negotiations with the communists. And remember, he had that famous opening to China, and he and Henry were over there talking to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. Remember that?
I do. Well, I wasn't alive then, but I remember reading about it, and that was
very famous. And he started talking to Brezhnev and Gromyko were the guys running the Soviet Union at the time. Brezhnev was the head of the party, and Gromyko was the foreign secretary. They were talking to those guys all the time. So nobody knew where that came from, but believe me, sitting at that time, I was running the political section of the NATO desk in the State Department, in the Bureau of European Affairs. That's the desk responsible for sending instructions to the U.S. mission to NATO, which is in Brussels. Most people think NATO is only a big military operation. It is still a big military operation, but it has political leadership, just like our Defense Department is directed by civilians.
Sure.
NATO is run by civilians at the North Atlantic Council in Brussels. So but we send the guidance to every meeting they have at NATO about the U.S. position. That's what the desks do. Okay, so I was head of the political section of the NATO desk when Nixon made this famous speech. Then about 3 months later, there was a 20th anniversary of NATO meeting in Washington at the post office building. So at that time we only had 15 allies, but all those heads of state came to Washington. Of course, all they could talk about was the era of negotiations and how we're going to do this anyway. And the allies wanted to say too, that, by the way, if you start negotiating, we want to play.
Right.
We want to play. We don't want just you talking to people like Brezhnev. We want to talk to them too. After all, this is Europe, right? It is Europe. It's our continent.
Right.
And we like to please our publics too by doing a little détente dance. And we'd like to do that. We want to involve ourselves. So anyway, right after that, Nixon wrote to the Secretary of State over in the State Department, a guy named Rogers, and he sent a very short message. And he said, henceforth, we're prepared to negotiate on any issue of mutual interest with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which of course is the equivalent of NATO on the eastern side. And that message came over to Rogers, and it came down through the State Department bureaucracy, to the European Bureau, then to my desk. The original came to my desk.
Unbelievable.
So I looked at that and I said, boy, the people at the White House are really getting smart. They realize that our allies will definitely want to negotiate too. It's not going to be a one show. It's going to be a multilateral event. I said, this is a cinch. You know, if we have a peace conference, we're talking now about the post-World War II peace conference. This is what we're talking about, right? We never had a police. Right. We didn't have a Versailles after World War II. Right. And we didn't have a Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars. This is something rather different. The long postponed peace conference, so everybody's very interested. And I said it was obvious to me, this is a fantastic idea. One, the White House realizes that this is going to be multilateral. The second thing they realize, I'm sure, is that this is a great opportunity for us to kind of throw the book at the Soviets. Any issue. Right. I said, well, what we should do a list of all the issues we have with them since the war, everything. Ready for Europe, throwing journalists out the window, invading, attacking Berlin, running the Red Army all over Eastern Europe. We had a long issue. Right. So I chaired an interagency committee myself, sitting down and asking every agency in Washington that mattered, because the CIA was there and the DIA was there and the Commerce Department was there and USIA, the propaganda agency, they're all there. And we sat down for about 3 months and we thought of every issue we could think of. We came up with a list of about 40 issues. So the idea, if we ever go to Helsinki, if we actually go there, to negotiate, we're going to have a long roster of things to talk about, right? Right. We know what the Soviets want two things from Helsinki. Sure. They want, first of all, the permanent division of Germany, number one.
Right, East and West Germany, yep.
And also respect of the post-World War borders, right, including their control over all of Eastern Europe. Right. That's what they want everybody to sign up to. And it was worth anything to get that imprimatur. The apparatchiks in Moscow really wanted that. But when we finally got to Helsinki, we were going to show up with 40 issues to talk about. Sure. None of which they wanted to talk about. Yeah. Especially a whole ton of human rights issues. And that's the last thing they wanted to talk about. But so anyway, we developed this in Washington, and I ran that program, and I was then asked to go to work, change my location, and go to U.S. mission to NATO, and work with the Allies to hammer out a common position. But if we work through NATO to make sure everybody has the same position, we will be tough in Helsinki, and that's exactly what happened.
So this is, at this point, you're trying to align all of the allies, all the U.S.
Align all the allies with these positions. So when we go to Helsinki, all 15 states would have the same position, and that's exactly what happened. That's the way it worked.
I want to make this quick comment, Leo, because we're going to talk about your book here in just a minute, which is fascinating, and I read it cover to cover, and it's terrific, and would certainly encourage our audience to pick that up on Amazon. It's well worth every penny you spend on it. It's a fascinating narrative of this history. But I just want the world of technical education to hear what you're hearing, and that is this gentleman Leo Reddy, who we know so well through his work and career in technical education. We know so well through his work at MSSC. You literally led the group that went over and prepared the U.S. allies in advance of the Helsinki Accords to align everybody in terms of what we felt was important from a negotiation standpoint. Am I hearing that right?
That's absolutely correct. But what's really interesting is the huge opposition we faced. Huge opposition, particularly from Henry Kissinger.
I certainly know who Henry Kissinger was, but for our audience, who is Henry Kissinger? What role was he in at that point in time?
Well, he was first. When Nixon came in, he was the national security advisor to President Nixon.
Right.
And they got along very well, those two, in terms of foreign policy. Nixon was very good at foreign policy, actually. Quite sophisticated. They get along just great, and they loved each other. Huh. They were a strong team. When, of course, Nixon left and Jerry Ford came in, Kissinger became the Secretary of State.
Right.
So he was the Secretary of State during much of this period.
And so what we're hearing is that there's this tension, if you will, between the individuals that you're working with and the Secretary of State in terms of how exactly we approach these accords, which, again, for our audience's benefit, I mean, this really laid the groundwork in many ways for what happened, 16 and 17 years later as the Cold War ended and, of course, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And this work that you did was so fundamental in terms of framing out how that played out, probably even more fundamental maybe than many realized or even you realized at the time. But this is a really historic event. So keep going. So you're on your way. You're going over and talking with the allies about how we're going to approach the Helsinki Accords. What comes next?
And that worked. I went over for the opening of those talks, and Secretary of Delegation. We had this 2 years of discussion about all these issues. I mean, the Soviets had to make up their mind. When we started putting those 40 issues in their box, the first guy they complained with was Henry Kissinger. They said, "You didn't tell us this was going to happen here. What the hell is this anyway?" It's one of the reasons he got upset about this thing. He was getting an earful from his pals in Moscow about it. Why are you trying to crucify us with all these issues, particularly all these human rights issues? So that was very interesting. So in any case, we completed the negotiation. We developed this long document, about a 60-page document. The Soviet document that they first put in the box the first day was exactly what I told you. Their draft of the agreement from this conference, those two issues. We came in with this huge package, ended up 58 pages of stuff.
Right.
A very, very long, detailed thing. On the basis of that, and its soundness, Jerry Ford made a very important decision to sign it. So Jerry Ford came to Helsinki. All the heads of state were there. 35 nations were there in Helsinki. And he signed it, right? Now, the very next thing that happened is there's a huge opening for his main contender to be president in 1976 in the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan.
Sure.
Right? Ronald Reagan was the guy who was competing with him to be. Ronald Reagan went after that thing big time.
Did he?
After the Helsinki Accords. So if you look at the GOP platform in 1976, the platform of the Republican Party, it denounces his signature of the Helsinki Accords.
Interesting.
Officially, the whole Republican Party, right?
Fascinating.
So poor, our estimable President Ford was in a terrible position, but he said he kept defending it. But during the debate with Carter and in the press interviews, he made a couple of really stupid statements. He said, "Yeah, I signed the accords, but I don't, and I think they will help to bridge differences. But besides, I don't believe, Jerry Ford, don't believe that the Soviet Union actually has control over Eastern Europe."
Oh, geez.
Can you imagine anybody being that boneheaded? Of course they had control. They were shooting people, killing people all over Hungary, Czechoslovakia, you name it. And because it sounded like an absolutely stupid statement, and it cost him the election. He admitted himself in his own bio. He admits it. Rumsfeld was a great friend of Ford, wrote a book, and he chastised Ford for making a stupid statement that cost him the presidency. You see what I mean? So a lot of very important political implications. Let me just add one more. That Henry Kissinger, of course, opposed the thing at the very end.
Right.
He had to go, and he sat with Ford, and he had to be there while they were signing the thing. Very uncomfortable. However, several years later, Henry Kissinger And at the funeral for Zakharov, who was a very famous Russian dissident, he apologized publicly. Imagine Henry apologizing for anything. If you know Henry, it seems impossible. Apologized for criticizing the Helsinki Accords. It's really kind of interesting. The ironies of history are really interesting.
Right, absolutely.
Because what happened, you may remember, again, very, very quickly, what happened after the Helsinki Accords were signed,
right?
The dissidents, there were always a lot of dissidents behind the scenes in Russia and the Warsaw Pact countries. They came above ground, and they formed what they call Helsinki monitoring groups. We are going to, you sign these accords, we are going to monitor you to determine whether or not you're abiding by those awards. The Soviets underestimated the reaction that would cause to them at home, right?
Yep.
They missed it. They thought they could fully control it.
And I remember reading that in the book. Let me just interrupt you, if you don't mind, Leo, with a couple thoughts. First of all, it's fascinating to me how you just kind of throw some of these names around. But you briefly mentioned Rumsfeld. Of course, that's Donald Rumsfeld, who later became the Secretary of Defense, if I'm correct, in the Bush administration.
Yeah. He was ambassador to NATO when I knew him. He was U.S. ambassador to NATO.
Got it.
Nixon's ambassador to NATO.
And you've got Henry Kissinger, and you're talking about him. So that part of it is just fascinating. And Gerald Ford, of course, and I actually remember when he stepped into the presidency, and of course in '76. By then I was 8 or 9 years old when President Jimmy Carter beat him in the '76 election. But back to the Helsinki Accords for a moment. I want you to touch on something that I think is really important, especially in the day and age that we live in. This whole idea that you talk about with freer movement and all of the human rights aspects of what you were going after there. I mean, I want to make sure that's not lost on our audience. With the world that we lived in then and the limitations on freedom, talk a little bit about this idea of freer movement and as it relates to human rights.
Well, of course, the whole idea of freer movement of information, ideas, and information was one of our platforms. And Helsinki was the last thing in the world the Soviet Union was interested in, because they had ironclad control over these states, these vassal states in Eastern Europe. And you had to have been there during that time to realize that. And, of course, we had all kinds of tensions with them themselves. The Helsinki Accords, of course, said we have to kind of jam Radio Free Europe, right?
Right.
You have to stop jamming Voice of America, right? You have to be nice to the church, church.
Right.
The Vatican was there, and so forth. That was the atmosphere at the time. Jews immigrating, we're all in favor of letting them Jews leave Russia, which they firmly opposed. I mean, we used the dynamic of this and this fervent desire they had to get a deal out of this conference to require major concessions. But it wasn't until several years later that the impact of the dissidents began to, and you remember people like Havel and Polensa, these are the dissidents, right?
Right.
Now they run the show there. Now they have taken over. The Soviet Union is gone, and but we're living in an entirely different era.
Well, and the Helsinki Accords really laid the groundwork for that in a lot of ways. So you start to think about this world that we're living in and this idea of freer movement and the incredible constraint there was on religious freedom, on the sharing of technological advancements, science, the arts. I mean, all of these things. It was almost
technology cooperation, business cooperation, all kinds of stuff.
Exactly. So you create this environment, again, 16, 17 years before the fall of the Soviet Union, when literally now people start talking. We've got people traveling to other areas. We've got people emigrating from Russia in some cases and sharing ideas. And we really kind of creted this potential for a new world order. Is that overstating it? I mean, did we really, the work that you did in so many ways was instrumental in the world that we live in today? Is that fair to say?
Well, I certainly can document my role. It's well documented. I got into hot water with some of the people because of this, and some of Kissinger's people particularly, and they played hardball.
Right.
The Kissinger White House played hardball. They played hardball with me. I mean, I had plenty of rough moments because of all this, but it all turned out well. Gorbachev said he loved the Helsinki Accords. He says, our new European home.
Right.
It's going great. Now, the problem is there's another guy who came along a bit later named Mr. Putin who violated all the Helsinki Accords.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. And it's obviously a different world that we live in now. But imagine
it's the world we live in now, which is really a shame. But in that time, we were looking at a new order and a good order, a much more peaceful, much more collaborative, much more promising, a happier situation for the Russian people who have suffered terribly for such a long time.
No question. You think about the time from the early '90s through the at least the mid-teens of this century, and even today, continuing. I mean, it's in a lot of ways a much better world than so many people lived in at that point in time. And you had such a huge impact on it. You documented that impact in a book, The Helsinki Process: Historic American Achievement in Relentless Diplomacy. You co-authored it with James E. Goodby. Like I said, it's a great read. It's a fascinating read. It is available on Amazon. It's not hard to get your hands on. But your influence didn't stop there. So, following the Helsinki Accords and before the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, you served in the State Department during the administrations of both President Jimmy Carter and my political hero, anyway, Ronald Reagan. What were you doing at that point in time? And tell us a little bit about your work following the Helsinki Accords.
Yeah, I want to thank you for giving me an opening to give my two bits on Ronald Reagan. But, chronologically, after the Helsinki Accords were over, one of the places I went to work was over at USIA during the Carter administration. That was the U.S. Information Agency. They ran Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, all cultural libraries, cultural exchanges, ping pong matches, whatever you could do to make people-to-people contacts across the divide. And there are a lot of very fine people working there. I headed up a staff of 100 people many of them were from Eastern Europe and many of them were from Russia. But they were native people. They studied all the original documentation and they did this analysis of the programs. That was really, really quite a lot of fun. And they're another good example of people who are working hard in the public interest. But then what happened not long after that is that I was sent to Vienna, back to Vienna.
Yeah, there you go.
For 5 or 6 years in Vienna, actually, working on something called conventional force reductions, mutual and balanced force reductions, which was an effort
MBFR,
on behalf of the Soviet Union and ourselves and all the states, all the Warsaw Pact states, all the NATO states, reduce the level of the forces. In other words, particularly take a lot of Red Army troops out of Eastern Europe.
Right.
That isn't something those people like Brezhnev and Gromyko want to do very quickly, right?
For sure.
They're in no hurry to take, because they know what's going to happen. If they pull out, they're going to collapse. They're going to lose control. So it was a hard negotiation, and a lot of effort went. It was slow moving, but it did eventually eventuate into a treaty called the Conventional Forces in Europe. So I was very much involved in that whole process, which did lead to the CFT treaty. But I missed the treaty because while I was there, I was approached, and as the senior advisor of the U.S. delegation to those conventional force talks, I was approached by the guy who took over the negotiations in Geneva, a treaty on intermediate range nuclear forces, as we get INF.
INF treaty, you bet.
Now, people may remember that in the late 1970s and so forth, we had a negotiation in Geneva between the Soviets and ourselves on reducing or trying to get rid of the SS-20. Now, the SS-20 was a new Soviet missile that they deployed into Central Europe, okay? It was medium range. It couldn't reach the United States, right?
Right.
It's not an ICBM. It's a medium range, but it sure as hell could reach Europe.
Okay, yeah.
And the problem with this SS-20 thing, it was fiendishly advanced, super advanced. It was MIRV. It had 9 warheads each.
Wow.
They were deep penetrating. They had special fuselages to reduce detection, like stealth, kind of very, very, very advanced and extremely powerful. They'll blow the hell out of Paris if they won't ever hit you, right?
Wow.
End Paris overnight.
Sure.
So they move them in, and everybody's scrambling around trying to figure out how to get them out.
Right.
So during that particular period, there was a talk in Geneva with Paul Nitze, who was a very famous strategist, national security strategist since World War II, a very, very well-respected person. He talked to his Soviet counterpart, a guy named Kvitsinski, and guess what they did? They took a walk in the woods.
Okay.
A walk in the woods in around outside of Geneva, and they cooked up their own solution, right?
Cool.
And the problem was that their mutual governments had never heard of these solutions, and they got the rug pulled right out from under them, right?
Oh, really?
The whole thing just collapsed overnight. That was called the Walk in the Woods, which became quite a famous thing. It was now they made a Hollywood movie out of a Broadway show, I think.
Okay, really?
Walk in the Woods, and so those guys came out. However, what happened next was that Ronald Reagan was elected. Okay.
Yep, 1980.
Ronald Reagan said these SS-20 missiles are indeed very threatening to our allies, and we've got to do something about them. But there's only one thing you can do to delete their impact. Namely, we have to deploy our own missiles.
Right.
We have to negotiate from a position of strength.
Mm-hmm.
And Reagan's first administration was all about strength. They were building so many defense plants in Southern California. The state was sinking into the Pacific Ocean. There's so many defense plants, right?
Right.
Position of strength. So he said, okay, we're going to deploy our missiles, called the Pershing missiles.
Mm-hmm.
Same kind of missiles, medium range, MIRV, very powerful, multiple warheads. The nuclear weapon had as much bang there as the SS-20. We're going to deploy those missiles.
In Western Europe?
And he did. Now, that almost brought down the governments of Europe. I don't know if you remember that point in time. But,
sure.
But Margaret Thatcher almost lost power.
Prime Minister of England.
Helmut Kohl in Germany. There were huge demonstrations all over Europe, all over Western Europe. Women were picketing all the air bases in the UK. You see pictures of them, thousands of women screaming pacifists and so forth. Of course, the KGB was having a great time behind the scenes stirring the pot. They're enjoying this one. In Rome, they were erupting. That government was going to crash. It was a big thing going on. But finally, Reagan held, Thatcher held. They deployed the Pershing missiles. They put them in there, and they put them in there. Guess what happened? The Soviets came back and said, why don't we negotiate? Why don't we start negotiating again?
Right.
Scared the heck out of the Russians with his defense-based system. Star Wars.
Yep.
That was Reagan said, we're going to have Star Wars.
I remember it well.
The Soviets said, well, let's come back to Geneva. We want to talk about Star Wars. And we said, well, okay, but we want to talk to you also about these missiles. We're going to talk about Star Wars. Okay, well, and we'll resume the strategic talks. We'll start them up again, the strategic arm. And, of course, the Star. So we had a three-ring circus in Geneva, with negotiating the INF missiles, the defense and space missiles, the Star. We're all back in Geneva.
Well, and many would argue, if I'm not mistaken, and I'd like your perspectives on this, but that what was going on there in terms of the arms race, in terms of the threat of Star Wars, and folks aren't familiar with what that was. It was the whole idea that we would deploy technology to be able to shoot missiles out of space, and of course, out of the air, out of space. And so, of course, if somebody has that defensive technology now, that renders the other side's missiles much less effective, obviously.
Right.
So we create this competition. And so on one hand, you've got diplomacy and you've got negotiations going on. On the other hand, you've got this arms race taking place, which was incredibly expensive. It was incredibly expensive for the U.S., incredibly expensive for the USSR. And some would argue that allocation of capital toward defense and towards the arms race in the USSR was a big part of what ended up leading to the ultimate dissolution of the USSR. Is that fair to say? Am I characterizing that correctly?
Well, I think the Helsinki Accords had much more to do with the dissolution of the USSR, the loss of control over Eastern Europe. It was really the human rights provisions that really caused them a lot of trouble. But this is a little bit later. Now this is Reagan, and,
right.
And Reagan and Schultz. Reagan decided to go ahead, and he liked Gorbachev. Of course, Gorbachev was the big change agent. Suddenly, the old apparatchiks go, right?
Right.
And there have been a couple of them before, after Brezhnev and Gromyko, but they passed away, and they opened up an opportunity for Gorbachev to take over. So when Gorbachev took over, that really made a big difference to the INF Treaty. Now, what happened when they came back, we had in the meantime, and certainly I was involved with this, with all the different agencies and so forth, we had developed an on-site inspection regime. On-site inspection. The Russians had never accepted in their whole history. The Russian military had been very, very secretive. The idea of somebody coming and inspect you, on-site inspection, Reagan loved it because he had this thing about trust but verify.
Yep, right. I use that line all the time.
An on-site verification program.
Right.
And to everybody's total amazement, Gorbachev agreed to it.
Right.
Which opened the door to the fulfillment. We wrote this INF treaty. It abolished all medium-range missiles everywhere in the world and had this fantastic on-site inspection regime, a big success. And then at that point, Gorbachev came to Washington in 1987 and signed the treaty with Reagan in the White House. You see a lot of pictures still of Reagan and Gorbachev.
Remember it, you bet.
Signing this treaty. That was the treaty, the INF treaty. I was then made head of the Treaty Ratification Task Force.
Okay.
So we came back from Geneva after spending 3 years negotiating the INF treaty in Geneva. We came back, and I was put in charge to get the U.S. Senate to remember our Constitution. The U.S. Senate ratifies treaties. Easily said.
Right.
But if you know anything about the U.S. Senate, hard to do. As Bob Byrd used to say, you can't hurry the Senate. They're in no hurry. We've never been rushed. So all of a sudden, we're we're having all kinds of testimonies and so forth, and experts and blah, blah, blah. So, but it was just that treaty was ratified one day before Reagan got on the plane to go back to go to Moscow to exchange the instruments of ratification with Gorbachev.
Fascinating.
That was a very dramatic time itself. I mean,
I can
we weren't
imagine.
sure if that was going to happen, but
well, and Leo Reddy was in the middle of absolutely all of that, which is just, I mean, as I mentioned in our intro, I mean, you've got this incredible background that I think a lot of our listeners probably, haven't been familiar with. That background and that incredible influence, that incredible work led to Ronald Reagan personally honoring you with the Meritorious Service Award. And later the same year, which was 1988, you received the Presidential Award from Secretary of State George Shultz. So reflect on that a little bit, Leo. What does it mean to be honored with the Meritorious Service Award by Ronald Reagan, the Presidential Award by Secretary Shultz? What does that mean to you as an American and as a human being?
Well, I think for any professional person to be honored by your peers and to be recognized and by getting a prestigious award always feels good. It feels good professionally.
Right.
What really matters is this helps a lot career-wise. A good way to make more money, get promoted, and so forth. So these awards are helpful. But in my case, I was in the Cold War for a long, long time, for 33 years basically. But the Cold War was over, so I had an opportunity to go over to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, which is a very famous think tank in Washington.
Right.
Kissinger had his offices there, Brzezinski, a lot of famous people from the National Security Affairs crowd like me go there. And I do research, basically. You can do anything you want. You can work the Hill, which you can't do if you're sitting in a state agency. You can go talk to people in Congress. But you can write stuff, you can research stuff, you can do, you become very well recognized and publish things. So I thought that was good fun. The very first thing I did when I got there is I wrote a long paper with a colleague on NATO burden sharing. Now, you have to remember that one of Donald Trump's favorite successes, and I salute him for this. For this one, I salute him, was to keep harassing the Allies about paying more for NATO, ponying up at least 2% of your budget for NATO. Right. That's a real score. But we helped to document that. Trump came later, but everybody thought that was a very well documented study. We did all the research. On everything in NATO, all these infrastructures, the ports and the airports and the landing fields, these things are all very expensive. This infrastructure is very expensive. So who's paying we documented clearly we were paying a much, much larger portion of the bill than you should have, so that was fun. But at the same time I was doing that, there were people working next to me. This is a very interesting topic. A bunch of defense companies, CSIS is very defense-oriented, very conservative, and the defense companies give a lot of money. But the defense companies were all sitting around there scratching their heads, saying, the Cold War is ending. It's ending. It seems to be going away. We're all pals now with the Soviets. It's fantastic.
Yeah, what happens to our business, right?
And so what does that mean for us, though? What does it mean for our budgets, the future of our companies, right? So they were talking about this. They had a whole bunch of people working on it. I said, I'd love to work on that one. Because the people working were next to her. My father was the president of a large confectionery manufacturing company. I think my father was the president of Necco. You've heard of Necco wafers and so forth.
Of course, everybody remembers Necco wafers.
My father was the president of Necco for several years.
Yeah.
Anyway, so my father was an MBA from Harvard, and so my the family was very much involved in manufacturing. I love manufacturing. So I said, I'd like to sit down and listen to this. So I got involved with these people, and we had really a dialogue with the defense companies to develop what we call a dual use of an agile, flexible industrial base, so that the threat drops way back. We can cut back on the expenditures, and we can calibrate our budget a little bit based on that. But however, we've built on the capacity to surge quickly if we need to. Sure. And using a lot of automation and a lot of data storage and so forth. If they had to have a flexible, agile industrial base. But anyway, the companies like working with me on that topic, and I wrote a long report on that. So they offered to, so why don't you leave the government? This is the time to make my transition out of government and start a think tank on this topic, advanced manufacturing.
Sure.
So I did form a think tank called the National Council for Advanced Manufacturing. I was very happy that NAM, which everybody knows NAM, respects NAM, they offered me my office, which gave me a strong imprimatur, right?
Yep, awesome.
And we started working over at NAM, and that was kind of my transition out of the defense, out of the Foreign Service, that area into national policy.
Absolutely. Well, and ultimately into your role at MSSC. And I do want to note, by the way, and in as much as we're keeping this discussion focused on your incredible foreign service career and all the diplomacy you were involved in, and it's fascinating, we should note for our audience that if they do have interest in learning more about MSSC, we did a wonderful podcast episode with Leo Reddy, who is the CEO now, to talk all about the great things that MSSC is doing in creating the next generation of our workforce, and an incredible impact, of course, you being the co-founder and president of that great organization. I do want to ask you a question quick about the end of the Cold War, Leo. And I still remember exactly where I was when the Soviet Union fell, and it was for anybody that had lived during that period of time, such a transformative moment. I would even say my father, who lived through the world of through the end of World War II, as I already referenced, said that was one of the most amazing geopolitical events of his lifetime. What was it like for you, knowing that you had been so involved in the Cold War and diplomacy and the Helsinki Accords and so on? What was it like for you the moment that you realized that what was happening in Eastern Europe and that the Soviet Union was dissolving? I mean, tell us what that moment felt like.
It was very exhilarating. And what made it particularly interesting to me is that nobody saw it coming.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how many Kremlinologists are who work on the payroll in Washington?
Yeah.
We got an army of Kremlinologists, people who do nothing but read the tea leaves of the Kremlin.
Sure.
None of them called it.
Amazing.
Not one of them called it. Inside the government, nobody saw it coming at all.
Huh.
It's just the whole thing. The last person saw it coming was Gorbachev.
Yeah, right.
But he totally underestimated himself. The glue that held the Soviet Union together was hard glue. And I remember when there was an uprising in Poland shortly after Gorbachev came in.
Remember that well.
And normally the Soviet Union would just put the tanks in and kill all the people in the shipyard, right? Very simple. But Gorbachev decided not to. He was the great change agent, was really Gorbachev. He said, well, I'm not going to send in the Red Army to control these people in the shipyards who are on strike and raising all kinds of hell. I'm going to have the Polish army go in.
Right.
That was the end of everything. As soon as he made that decision, I said, boy, I have to read the tea leaves. It's over in terms of Soviet ironclad control over the Warsaw Pact. Is over.
Interesting.
Because, of course, that was a big joke that the Polish military themselves would go shoot all the people. They ended up having drinks. They ended up having vodka together or something.
Right.
Yeah. Totally unrealistic. But it was totally out of nowhere. But for somebody like myself who spent so many years, 33 years of my life, and the Cold War itself lasted 35 years.
Yep.
My whole life, basically.
Right.
It was really an exhilarating.
Exhilarating is
wonderful.
A great word for it.
I'm surprised I just didn't stop and go play golf, but I just still wanted to make a difference on the domestic side, I guess.
Well, and make a difference you have. Let's talk about that for a minute. You think about all the things, and we talked about the Helsinki Accords, we've talked about the INF Treaty, you've talked about Meritorious Service Award and the Presidential Award, and all these incredible accomplishments. Leo, if one stands out to you as your greatest one, if you had to pick just one, what would you say is your greatest accomplishment of your career?
Well, it's really hard to match the Helsinki agreement because I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. I was
the right person as well.
I head of the NATO desk on the political side, just as all of a sudden our president amazed everybody by saying we're going to start negotiating with the bad guys. I mean, it just happened to come along, but I think I did certainly call the right shot in saying the way we should respond to this is to pull together everybody who knew anything about the Cold War. The Soviet Union touched it all and just drop a list of everything we can think of.
Absolutely strategically brilliant.
They've been the bad guys, and then take that to NATO and iron out the positions. I was really the architect.
Yep, absolutely. Well, times have a way of finding their leaders is a line that I use often, and those times certainly found their right leader in the form of Leo Reddy. So just an amazing narrative, Leo, of what you were able to do in terms of shaping the future of world history. And in doing so, working with some really impressive and incredible leaders. You mentioned presidents, secretaries of state, people who went on to become secretaries of defense and so on. If you could think back on all these great leaders that you had the opportunity to interact with and choose just one of them, who would you say is the leader that made the greatest mark on you as a person? And what do you think? What traits do you think make a great leader?
I guess I have to say, too, I didn't know much about Ronald Reagan. I wasn't very much involved in domestic politics at the time, and he seemed to be a gifted guy, a good speaker, and so forth. He became president in a very hardline position. I really underestimated what he did and his decision to go ahead and work with Gorbachev and to go ahead and complete the INF Treaty. He was nominated by Michael Beschloss a few years ago as one of the most courageous of all of our presidents. And I never really thought of a courageous guy. I mean, he was a cool guy. He rode horses and he was nice to people, had a very nice personality, which he did, by the way. Much more likable than other people I can think of.
Right.
He got along well with everybody. He had a great personality personally, but he realized that to be successful, we really had to take negotiate a position of strength.
Absolutely.
And I give him great credit for that. A lot. So he was courageous as well as being smart.
Absolutely.
And so I think he stands very, very high in my books. The other one will surprise you.
Go ahead.
There's still a lot of things to be said about Henry Kissinger.
Yeah. But
still, he was an incredible person in terms of really doing his homework. He was very, very smart, of course, but extremely diligent. He was a legend in the State Department. When a visiting head of state or chief of a foreign secretary came to visit Henry, right, the desk there would send up notes to Henry. Henry would call the desk officer up there and read the book. Almost in every case.
Really?
He'd raise hell. Because the guy on that desk from any country, it could be Costa Rica, it could be France, it could be anything. Henry knew more about those countries and everything about those countries than any of those guys.
Interesting.
He really did. He was really, really smart.
Wow.
And so, doing your homework, knowing what you're talking about, is a very important lesson. And the only other point I make about Henry, which I get a big kick out of, is he also gave me something I've never forgotten, and maybe it impacts my own work, and maybe why MSSC still gives people a little pain in the neck. The press asked him in his heyday, said, "Is it true, Henry? Is it true that you are the smartest man in the world? Can you document that? Can you prove that?"
Yeah.
He said, I cannot prove that. I'd like to be able to, but I really can't. I don't disagree with it necessarily, but I can't prove it. But I can tell you one thing, that I try to stay 1 year ahead of everybody else in my thinking.
Wow. Yeah, that's brilliant.
Think about that if you're in business.
Oh, my goodness.
You don't have to invent the greatest thing in the world. The really important thing is that you're ahead of your competition in your thinking.
Yep.
And I thought it was a wonderful lesson for everybody in any line of business to try to do that. And we do this a little bit in MSSC. We keep saying we're the cutting edge of change. We want to keep pace with technological change, keeping ahead. That's why I'm doing less AI work right now and working hard on AI because it is the wave of the future.
It is, aren't we both? And to hear you talking about it.
I don't like it, but we got to work on it. But
I love it.
Henry, what am I doing this anyway?
Staying 1 year ahead. Well, and let's think about that. I mean, that's an awesome answer, actually, Leo, to that question. I mean, first of all, as you know, I share the admiration for Ronald Reagan. But thinking about, you talk about courage and being courageous, and certainly in foreign policy he was courageous. Economically he was courageous too. Almost nobody agreed with his economic approach to raising interest rates to slow down the growth of the economy, to control inflation early in his career and early in his term, and that was a life or death in terms of politics decision that he made. He's courageous in doing that as well, and his ability to communicate so clearly to the American people and to the globe, really, really interesting. This idea of doing your homework and Henry Kissinger, who, if people read the book, and we touched on this a little bit, there was some tension between the work that you were doing on the Helsinki Accords and between Kissinger, and to come back and say two of the greatest lessons that you learned from leaders came from Henry Kissinger is a really classy reflection, I think, on your way of looking at the world, Leo. But the idea of doing your homework, really, really important, and then staying 1 year ahead of everybody else. I mean, that is great. Whether you're a diplomat, whether you are a governmental leader, whether you are a business leader, whether you're going through your education journey, thinking 1 year ahead and trying to stay 1 year ahead of everybody else, that's a really, really a strong statement and a really interesting way of looking at it. I'm going to take all three of those away, and you can rest assured that I'll use that a few times down the road and reference my good friend Leo Reddy when I do. Regrettably, our time is coming to a close. Who would argue with the incredible conversation that we have had today with Leo Reddy? We knew about his incredible impact in the world of career readiness, in the world of career and technical education, in the world of workforce development. I know a lot of us, and certainly I didn't know to the depth that I do now, the incredible influence and impact that you had on the world that we live in today. I want to thank you, Leo, so very much for spending time with us here on the Tech Ed Podcast. It's been wonderful. You're an incredible leader. You have an incredible background. You're an incredible friend, and it's been an incredible episode. So thank you for being with us.
I'm truly honored, Matt. Really, the person of your distinction would select me because I'm one of your great admirers also.
And it's been an honor to spend time with you.
Thank you.
I want to thank Leo Reddy for this awesome episode of the Tech Ed Podcast, learning about his incredible background, taking a walk through world history, learning about the events that shape the world that we live in today. It's been a terrific episode. Leo referenced a ton of information, and we're going to put all of that into the show notes. We'll also make sure there's a link in those show notes so that you can jump on Amazon and order this incredible book, Helsinki Process, Historic American Achievement in Relentless Diplomacy. It is a great read. Check out those show notes at techedpodcast.com/reddy, REDDY. Check out the show notes there and check us out on social media. We are all over Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and LinkedIn. Wherever you go for your social media, you will find the Tech Ed Podcast. Connect to us, comment, link to us. We want to know you're out there. We appreciate you being with us this week and every single week on the Tech Ed Podcast. Until our next episode, I'm your host, Matt Kirkner. Thanks for being with us.